summary statement from Dr. Ed Masters on the history of errors by the Steere-Camp. He states, first off, they said Lyme disease was a new disease, which it isn't, or wasn't. Then it was thought to be viral, but it isn't. Then it was thought that seronegativity didn't exist, which it does. Then they thought it was easily treated by short courses of antibiotics, which it sometimes isn't. Then it was only the Ixodes damini tick, which we now know is not even a separate valid tick species. So Masters goes on to say, if you look throughout history, almost every time a major dogmatic statement has been made about what we know about this disease, it was subsequently proven wrong or underwent major modifications. So what do all these errors have in common? Wrong in the right direction. They effectively justify symptom treatment only for Lyme disease, which is what Alan Steere's been proposing since the early 70s. So these policies, I claim, are tailor-made to make the disease very difficult to diagnose, very dangerous to treat for doctors, and very expensive to treat for patients. This is, again, a Wikipedia article stating that although Lyme disease is presented as this simple illness by these Steere-Camp experts, it has a multifaceted appearance and nonspecific symptoms. It's called the great imitator. This makes it a nightmare to diagnose and treat. It can masquerade as multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, lupus, Crohn's, etc., etc. So this is a nightmare for patients and doctors, and it's presented as this simple-minded disease. Skip this. But ultimately, it's dominated by the pharmaceuticals industry and consultants, and it's also dominated by biowarfare experts, and it's being used as a vaccine development effort coordinated by biodefense institutions and researchers. Okay, I believe the whole treatment denial scenario is actually orchestrated to favor symptom treatments over root cause treatment, and vaccine development and vaccine marketing. Again, Steere led not only the early investigation into Lyme disease from the 70s, but all the way into the 90s. He led the first field trials for the Lyme-Rix vaccine. This is an article by Smith, Klein, Beecham thanking Dr. Steere for his help in conducting the efficacy trials. They state, in this regard, we are indebted to Alan Steere, whose advice on evaluating the adverse events, especially the serious adverse events, has been invaluable. Steere was an expert on adverse events because he'd been watching patients suffer from Lyme disease his whole career. Again, the vaccine was developed because they had a unique set of serial samples from untreated patients monitored throughout the course of the disease. And only with this set of serial samples was it possible to watch the antibody response develop. This is Steere's employer was Yale University. This is one of the patents on the OspA vaccine. This is patent by Smith, Klein, Beecham on another OspA vaccine component. This is a statement by Wormser, who's also the lead author for the treatment guidelines, stating that this is the reason you want to monitor patients over a long period of time. Basically, they saw that patients who had short-term Lyme disease were able to be reinfected, but patients who had so-called late manifestations did not seem to be reinfected. So it was as if the immune system developed over a period of time with a long-term infection. So if they could learn what exactly was developing and which immune components were responsible, they could use that in a vaccine. So the longer the patients are infected with untreated Lyme, the more immune they appear to future infections. And this might allow them to mimic natural forms of immunity in a vaccine. Again, this is the Tuskegee rationale stated if you have a chronic disease such as syphilis, this necessitates a long-term study of the natural history of the disease before the effectiveness of programs for the control of the disease can be evaluated properly, such as vaccines. Again, I think what they're doing is making the vaccine look cost-effective compared to an untreated epidemic. I'm going to get more into the detail of this now. This is the article by the CDC authors, the cost-effectiveness of vaccinating against Lyme disease. And I believe this is the so-called blueprint for the Steere-Camp of Lyme disease treatment denial. This was the summary of the article where they state that few communities have average annual incidences of Lyme disease greater than 0.5%. But what they found out was that the economic benefits of the vaccines will be greatest in individuals who have a risk of, or a probability of contracting Lyme disease greater than 1%. So this was a problem. Communities that had 0.5% probability of Lyme, that was in the high region, and what they needed was communities that had a greater than 1% chance of contracting Lyme for the vaccine to be cost effective. And this is the cost effectiveness formula here on the right that they used. This is another article with a similar title, The Cost Effectiveness of Vaccination Against Lyme Disease. This was supported by the NIH, and again, their conclusion was the vaccine would only be economically attractive for individuals who have a probability of getting Lyme disease greater than 1%. And this is the cost effectiveness formula on the right, and these are some curves on the left, which they plot. So on the bottom here you have, this is the probability of getting Lyme disease. And on the left is the cost effectiveness. So you want this to be low. You want to show that you're saving money by vaccinating against Lyme disease. You can do that, for example, if the vaccine has a long efficacy period. So these are vaccines that are effective from 2 to 5 years. So if the vaccine is longer for 5 years, of course, it's going to save more money than a vaccine that's only effective for 2 years. Or you can make the vaccine look cost effective by increasing the attack rate of Lyme disease. So this is your probability of getting Lyme disease. So if that goes up, then the cost appears to go down, the cost that you're saving by getting a vaccine. So as the Lyme disease attack rate goes up, the cost effectiveness ratio improves. So what's bad for the public is good for the Lyme vaccine marketing strategists. This is a common theme. This is another way they plotted the cost effectiveness. So in this case, you have on the x-axis, you have the probability of getting diagnosed and treated for Lyme disease early, which again, if you're public and you want to be treated and diagnosed for Lyme disease, you want that to be high. And this is the cost savings of getting vaccinated against Lyme disease. So you want the 0 point is way up here. If you're below that, you're actually losing money. If you're above that, you're saving money by getting vaccinated. So they looked at a case of 0.5%, which is where the article said some communities were back in the 90s. And they looked at doubling that and then tripling that, and looked at the resulting cost savings. So let's look at the 0.5% region. So this is, if you have a community in which the probability of getting Lyme disease is only 0.5%, and you have 3 vaccines going from the one at the top is the cheapest vaccine, and the one at the bottom is the more expensive vaccine. In this case, none of these vaccines are cost effective, but note that as the probability of getting a good diagnosis for Lyme disease goes up, the cost effectiveness of the vaccine goes down. So again, for 0.5% probability of getting Lyme disease, which was a realistic probability in the 90s, for any probability of getting diagnosed and treatment, you have no cost savings for a vaccine. So all these vaccines are in the red here, and they're below the 0 line. So none of them actually save money, so you can't market it. So what's good for the public, high probability of getting diagnosed, is bad for vaccine marketing. So again, let's look at the same curve. Now we're going to double or increase by 100% the probability of getting Lyme disease, which is bad for patients. But look what happens, these curves get pushed up, and now the cheapest vaccine is actually made to look cost effective. So the cheapest vaccine becomes cost effective unless the probability of getting diagnosed is very high. So what's good for vaccine marketing is bad for the public. So let's triple the probability of getting Lyme disease again. So now we're 500% above where we started out, which was over here at 0.5%. So now we're 3% chance of getting Lyme disease, which is of course horrendous for the public. But look what happens, these curves get pushed up, and now all 3 vaccines are now made to look cost effective. So the cost savings per case averted goes positive for all 3 vaccines, from the cheapest to the most expensive, with a 500% increase in the probability of contracting Lyme disease. So if you have a low probability of getting Lyme disease, all 3 of these vaccines can be made to look cost effective. Only in the if you have like a 90% chance of getting diagnosed and treated, the most expensive vaccine will look not cost effective. So what's good for Lyme patients, again, is bad for vaccine marketing. So if you're interested in a Steere-Camp vaccine marketing agenda, you benefit if the probability of Lyme disease is high. We went from 0.5% to 3%, so that's a 500% increase. And if the probability of getting diagnosed and treated is low, all three of these vaccines can be made to look cost effective. So I believe this is the blueprint for the so-called Steere-Camp of Lyme disease and the disastrous policies that have resulted. Again, this is the Meltzer article which states that the probability of contracting Lyme disease is the most important factor in determining the economic benefit of vaccinating against the disease. Again, they went from 0.5% to over 1% to make the vaccine look cost effective. So they needed Lyme disease rates to go up. So I asked, were CDC policies put into place to correct this? I believe they were. And were CDC trained epidemiologists, such as Alan Steere, put in place to justify these disastrous treatment denial policies to make the vaccine look cost effective as outlined in the CDC publication? And I believe they were. And I believe this is the result. So these are some of the articles I showed up front showing that this summer was one of the worst summers for Lyme disease in history. And again, the rate is actually 10 to 50 times higher than what the official statistics are saying. So doctors in the field are confronting an epidemic which is being unreported or underreported in the official statistics. And this is, again, international cases in the UK have tripled since these articles were written. And again, remember, in the cases they analyzed, they looked at tripling the Lyme disease rates. So they basically defined the disease out of existence in order to get these rates sky high to prevent any effective public health measures against the disease. This is an article from the Washington Post a few months ago. This is a woman, a writer, stating that her husband got Lyme disease, and her doctor diagnosed chronic Lyme disease in her husband, but many experts say it doesn't exist because they've defined it out of existence. He was treated with long-term antibiotics and got better and better, just like I did. And again, this is another article showing that getting diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease is very controversial, and you'll have a very difficult time getting treatment for it. And as a result, only 2% of the doctors in Ground Zero in Connecticut are willing to treat the epidemic. This is another article on the cost effectiveness of the Lyme disease vaccine, and they state that the vaccine is only cost effective in individuals who live in areas where Lyme disease is endemic, and for people who are frequently exposed to ticks. And guess what? That's exactly what's going on. This is an article from a few months ago stating that ticks in the Cape Cod area are sky high. It's actually shutting down recreation areas. Again, campsites are being closed. And from the UK to Texas, they're finding out that the prevalence rates in the ticks are higher than were claimed by the experts, and that there are actually more tick species spreading Lyme disease than the experts will admit. So we have a CDC study which spelled out the cost savings of vaccination against Lyme disease treatments. The inputs included the following: the cost of the vaccination, the probability of contracting the disease, the cost of successfully treating either the early symptoms or the late symptoms, and the probability of the disease disseminating. So in other words, the article reveals how a business case could be made to offset the costs of a very expensive Lyme disease vaccine if the probability of contracting the disease increases. The cost of treating the disease increases. The probability of correctly diagnosing the disease decreases. And the probability of effectively treating the disease decreases. And correspondingly, the probability of developing short and long-term complications actually increases. So I propose that this CDC article actually gives us insight into the guiding principles behind the so-called Lyme disease cartel, which is largely managed by CDC epidemiologists, and it therefore provides an understanding of the real goals behind the disastrous policies advocated by the so-called Steere-Camp of Lyme disease. So the policies advocated by this Steere-Camp that have resulted in pain for Lyme disease victims represents gain for vaccine interests. This is a little chart I made up showing the article I just showed states that if you increase the probability of contracting the disease, you make the vaccine marketing argument better. And if you increase the cost to treat without vaccines, you make the marketing argument look better. And if you increase the apparent effectiveness of the vaccine, which is what they did when the Lyme vaccine came out, you make the marketing argument look better. And these are all positions that are consistent with the Steere-Camp of Lyme disease, which spreads misinformation about the vectors and the prevalence and the symptoms, exaggerates the effect of the vaccine and treatment, and thereby, with all this misinformation, increases the probability of sequelae due to the early and late disseminated infection. And they've also reduced the number of doctors available to treat the disease through these treatment guidelines. So one of the ways they're doing this is denying the level of tick infestations in various states. The treatment guidelines, as I said, are used to deny the treatment and put doctors out of business, even if people come back with a positive Lyme disease test. And the state medical boards are used to punish the dissenters. So one of the ways they do this is they have the various epidemiologists from the CDC in this biowarfare group within the CDC called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And it's their job to infiltrate the state agencies and determine whether illnesses that break out are due to biowarfare agents. But as a measure of their influence, this is an article stating that in the year 2000, 43% of state and territorial epidemiologists were EIS graduates. So that's almost half of the state epidemiologists are members of this subgroup of the CDC, which is specializing in biowarfare, which allows them to coordinate policy and help put doctors out of business. So I believe, this is an article I published 2 summers ago in the Public Health Alert stating that they're actually conducting a biological warfare experiment on American citizens, and it has resulted in spreading an epidemic. Anybody happen to read this article? You can see it online. And I call this the institutionalization of biological warfare, because they can control the response to an epidemic through these treatment guidelines, and therefore prevent people from getting treated for it, and effectively wage biological warfare through treatment guidelines. So interestingly enough, the author of this article that I've gone over, the CDC cost effectiveness article, has presented at EIS conferences, so there's a good chance he is an EIS agent, just like Alan Steere. And in addition to authoring this article on this, how to make a vaccine appear cost effective, he's also written an article entitled The Economic Impact of a Bioterrorist Event. So we have yet another CDC biowarfare expert involved in Lyme disease vaccine policy. Just like Gary Wormser, who is the lead author of the infamous IDSA treatment guidelines, he also has written on bioterrorism. This is one of his articles. So I say, what's wrong with this picture? You have the lead author on treatment guidelines for a disease which is widely recognized to be a biowarfare agent, is also a lecturer on biowarfare. This is one of his video lectures. Again, lead author of treatment guidelines is also talking on how to treat biowarfare outbreaks, in this case anthrax, which turned out to be a leak from a biowarfare facility. So the pharmaceuticals industry has the clout to use the biowarfare infrastructure as a perpetual profit center. For example, they can create pathogens and develop profitable symptom treatments, and they can dominate the approval process for symptom treatments, and then mandate treatment through these treatment guidelines, and then use the treatment guidelines to facilitate the development of vaccines, and then enforce the vaccines through treatment guidelines. And these vaccines can actually perpetuate more symptoms, and the whole process can start over again. So this is a hypothetical situation I've outlined here. Just for the case of argument, it's possible that if you created such a pathogen, you could expose people to the pathogen through either an accidental release or deliberate experimentation, and prevent people from getting treated for it while monitoring the immune response, developing vaccines or other countermeasures, and testing this vaccine on an increasingly large population, which can be used to market the disease. Meanwhile, you're downplaying the complexity of the symptoms, allowing the epidemic to spiral out of control, making a vaccine appear more necessary, and then in the end you can suddenly admit the true nature of the epidemic, and oh, by the way, we have this vaccine which now looks cost effective. Go back a step. All this was coordinated by the CDC and their Epidemic Intelligence Service in conjunction with private medical societies like the IDSA and leading academic institutions such as Yale in the case of Lyme disease. And it's facilitated by the revolving door between the pharmaceuticals industry and government. For example, it's an article stating that former CDC director is now leading the Merck vaccine effort. So they have a well-oiled machine ready to implement such a scenario. Not sure how much time I have left. Back up a little bit here and discuss how Lyme disease is this incredibly complex infection, and yet it's made to look like it's hard to catch and easy to cure by people who are actually making a living off of it. So why is there this deadly oversimplification of such an incredibly complex disease? Again, this is the article in which I state that they're actually conducting a biological warfare experiment by defining the chronic stage of the disease away. Again, Gary Wormser, who's the lead author on the so-called treatment guidelines, is also a bioterrorist expert. And actually on these IDSA treatment guidelines, over 20% of the authors are biowarfare researchers. We have Gary Wormser himself, the lead author, who actually lectures on biowarfare and led a disastrous vaccine effort for Lyme disease. You've got Alan Steere, author of the Steere-Camp, who is a CDC biowarfare specialist through the EIS group, and he also led a Lyme disease vaccine, which was a disaster. And we have Mark Klempner, who's also an author, who actually directed the biowarfare lab at Boston University. So for a disease that's hard to catch and easy to cure, there sure are a lot of biowarfare experts associated with defining how to treat it, or how not to treat it. So again, this is Wormser, so lead author of the IDSA guidelines, writing an article on how to treat the anthrax attacks, which happened in the wake of 9/11. He recommends long-term combination antibiotic therapy, which is exactly what the Lyme disease doctors recommend for Lyme disease, but this is not what Wormser recommends for Lyme disease. And this so-called setting of bioterrorism actually was a leak from the U.S. biowarfare facility. This is an article from a year or so ago showing that the U.S. government actually had to pay victims of the anthrax leak in the wake of 9/11 because it had come from the U.S. biowarfare lab. This is a Wikipedia article showing that the anthrax bug was identical to an Army strain, which was leaked somehow out of a U.S. biowarfare facility. This is a New York Times article stating that a lot of the people in the biowarfare community doubted the official story of how the lone nut was supposed to have released this agent into the public. And they they suspect that this is part of a vaccine agenda. They state that many people were refusing the inoculations, the anthrax vaccine, the vaccine's manufacturer was shut down. People were correlating Gulf War syndrome with the anthrax vaccine. So they state such an attack would in a single stroke eliminate the skepticism and second guessing about the need for an anthrax vaccine, which is exactly what happened. So now, not only are they continuing to administer the vaccine, but they're extending the testing to children. This is an article stating that the federal advisors have decided to endorse testing of the anthrax vaccine in children, even though it exposed healthy children to substantial harm with no possibility of benefit, according to one doctor. So we have a case of the anthrax vaccine where you have vaccine politics entering. You have a pathogen leak from a biowarfare facility aiding a vaccine effort. Is Lyme disease also such a case? Well, as it turns out, this is the paper that made Willy Bergdorfer famous. He's the namesake of Lyme disease. This was in Science magazine. This is authored by both Willy Bergdorfer and Alan Barber. Curiously, Willy Bergdorfer was working in a biowarfare lab when he discovered Lyme disease and subsequently became a military epidemiologist. Alan Barber now directs a biowarfare lab and was just awarded a Lyme vaccine contract last year. This is from my presentation last year showing Bergdorfer at work in the 50s in the Rocky Mountain Labs, which is a biowarfare vaccine development lab. This is showing Bergdorfer at the lab bench infecting ticks. with various disease agents, including Borrelia. So we have the namesake of Borrelia burgdorferi in 1982. His article was published, but back in the 1950s, you have Borrelia conjoined with the name of burgdorferi, or with burgdorferi, I should say. He was also feeding Excerpted ticks with various pathogens, and Excerpted ticks are the ones that were found in the 1970s, affecting people outside of a biowarfare lab. So this is from the blog of Under Our Skin, the movie about Lyme disease. And they state that they were actually interviewing Willie Burgdorfer, and they got a knock on the door, and it turned out to be somebody from the Rocky Mountain Labs who stated, I've been told that I need to supervise this interview. This comes from the highest levels. There are things that Willie can't talk about. So why can't Willie Burgdorfer talk about the disease that's named after him? Did any of Willie Burgdorfer's ticks make it to Plum Island? So how much time do I have, Sue?
About 3 minutes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go quickly over curious disease distribution. This may explain why Willie Burgdorfer is not allowed to talk about the disease that's named after him. This is also on the internet under an article called Where Did Lyme Disease Come From? So this is Plum Island Animal Disease Research, which is a biowarfare lab off the coast of Long Island that did tick research. This is Old Lyme, Connecticut, where Lyme disease first broke out in the 1970s. Curious. This is a book written by Michael Carroll called Lab 257. He was one of the first ones to postulate that Lyme disease and other pathogens had broke out from this lab and was causing infections starting in Lyme and spreading out all over the country. So I just went to the internet, to the CDC website, and got the surveillance statistics for Lyme disease. These are the county statistics. And I just picked the middle region here from 1997 to 2001. So these are the top 10 counties for Lyme disease in the United States, and I just plotted them on big maps. And you can see the distribution here. The only article I found was this one, and curiously they cut off the eastern part of Long Island, right where Plum Island would be. So I found that kind of interesting. But we can go back and look at official CDC maps back into the mid-90s. Right in the center, the red zone is the hot zone, where the highest cases are, highest incidence rates are, and Plum Island is right smack in the middle of that. This is the late 90s again, Plum Island right in the middle of the red zone. And a decade later, Plum Island right in the middle of it. So this is a statement by Michael Carroll stating that not only Lyme disease, but 3 infectious germs appear to have broken out from the same area, which is Plum Island, including not only Borrelia burgdorferi, but West Nile virus. And this is a New York Times article stating that West Nile actually did not originate with a mosquito. The first cases came from the syringe of a researcher at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. This is an article I wrote back in early 2001 before this New York Times article came out, showing that a researcher named Chester Southam was injecting people with West Nile virus and plotting the immune response at that one results. I wrote letters to the New York Times, and they finally picked up and wrote an article about this. But this is all part of a cancer vaccine effort. They were actually injecting people with tumor cell suspensions, trying to determine what the antibody response was so they could develop a cancer vaccine. So they did this tumor transplant research in mice, and they just replicated that in human beings. They injected people with cancer so they could monitor how the tumors would grow, and actually measured them and plotted them and published the results. And shortly before AIDS broke out, they were even injecting simian tumor viruses and monitoring the lesions that would break out. And this is the SV40 virus, the monkey cancer virus that they injected in people, and actually tabulated and published the results so they could compare the infected and non-infected cancer cell growth in people by measuring the nodules that we grow. So back to Plum Island, it has a history of safeguard issues, power failures, and they've even had disease outbreaks on 2 different occasions, but they claim the diseases never came off the island. But curiously, we have this epidemic of various diseases that surround the island. And consistent with that, the Biowarfare pathogen leak is this article states that there's a clone of Borrelia burgdorferi, which is highly pathogenic, and they state that this clone has dispersed rapidly and widely in the recent past, and likely continues to contribute to the rise of Lyme disease incidence. So I wonder where this clone came from, and how recent it really did arrive on the scene. And this is an article published stating that the phylogeography of Borrelia burgdorferi and its tick vector, the Excerpted tick, appear to be unrelated. They state that the evolutionary and biogeographic history of Borrelia burgdorferi does not reflect that of its tick vector. So it's almost as if the Borrelia agent and the tick vector were merged artificially in the lab. Well, curiously, we have Willy burgdorfer shown here in the lab. He's the namesake of Borrelia burgdorferi, and he was injecting Borrelia in various tick species back in the 1950s, long before the disease broke out, which was named after him. And he was even feeding ixoid ticks in the lab. So there is a precedent for people doing experiments with ixoid ticks and Borrelia. An epidemic of Lyme disease caused by such a relapsing Borrelia disease agent is centered around a different biowarfare lab that does vaccine research on Lyme. And treatment for the epidemic has been under the control of military vaccine proponents and institutions from the time of its discovery. And the treatment protocols are ideal for developing and marketing the vaccine, as I described. And it's all been enabled through the so-called Steere-Camp of Lyme disease.